For over a year, the young American Republic and the mighty British Empire had been engaged in a war that would come to be known as the War of 1812, though some call it the American Second War of Independence. The war had begun due to the British forces capture of American sailors out at sea to aid in their military operations against the French Empire, as well as a few other disputes including trade and the American frontier. We are now zooming ahead quite a bit to Lake Erie, where the British had maintained naval dominance for the entire duration of the war up until this point, with the naval force under Robert Harriet Barclay. Barclay had under his command two major sloop ships, Detroit and Queen Charlotte, the large schooner Lady Provost, a brig called General Hunter, and two smaller ships, the Chippeway and Little Belt. The American forces that were in the Lake Erie were under the command of Oliver Hazard Perry. He had under his command two large brigs, Lawrence, the flagship, and Niagara, a smaller brig called Caledonia, and 5 schooners, the biggest of which were the Ariel and the Somers, and a little sloop called Trip. Many of these ships had been built throughout the war, but unfortunately for the Americans, they were stuck in place because of a British naval blockade and a natural sandbar that made it quite difficult to get out of the port that they were sitting in, especially if you're under fire from cannons. So, this is really interesting because they actually built a whole bunch of ships here, then they couldn't get them out. But on July 29th, Barclay had to give up the blockade to resupply, and this gave Perry a 4-day window to get all his ships out onto open water, and he moved immediately. When Barclay returned on the 4th day, the ships had very nearly gotten out, except for the largest American ships. However, the Americans drew up their ships in such a confident line that the British were scared off for the time. The British wanted the Detroit, their biggest ship, to be fully operational before fighting, which allowed the Americans to exit their harbor and finally cut the British off from supplies as they set up camp in Put-in Bay, which is a port name or a little cove. With looming starvation, the Brits now were forced to give battle and come out on September 10th. At 7 a.m., Percy left to face the Royal Navy. The first shots rang out from the Detroit at 11:45. Perry had hoped to get into carronade range, which were short-ranged guns designed to be powerful anti-ship guns. The wind, however, slowed his approach, and he was racked by gunfire from 2 of the ships. And when he finally did get the Lawrence into range, the cannons had been improperly loaded and failed to do much damage. The Niagara, the other big American ship, was slow to engage as well, and left the Lawrence to be engaged by the 2 British ships all alone, and this ship was finally reduced to a wreck. And Perry had to retreat on a small boat to the Niagara, and the Lawrence surrendered. After the Lawrence surrendered, the Detroit, having been damaged by the fight with the Lawrence, crashed into the Queen Charlotte. As both ships had been managed to get there quite damaged, the Americans quickly took advantage of this and fired heavily on the 2 British ships, with the Niagara rushing in and laying out devastating fire. And though the British managed to get their ships untangled, they were out of order and surrendered shortly. The smaller British vessels tried to get away, but were caught quickly and surrendered. With this victory at sea or lake, the Americans could attack southwest Ontario, and soon would do so, bringing the fight into Canada. Hey there, grade 5. Today we're going to be learning about the formation of the Spanish Empire, or at least part of it. Just get some general ideas. So this is kind of what happened after Columbus. And then we'll go on to some other interesting characters after this. So the Spanish colonies in America, from the humble beginnings of just kind of showing up on the shore and settling in Cuba and part of the other island of Hispaniola, the Spanish went on to have a huge amount of territory in the Americas. You can see all the places in yellow on this map are where the Spanish had conquered. Now you can see some other territories there of other countries as well, but the Spanish had a humongous area. And a lot of the places that they took were some of the most populated as well. So how did they do all this? What happened between starting out with just a few, Columbus came with 1,200 people, and remember, 2/3 of those people died. So this was like a humongous empire afterwards, right? So this has grown quite a bit. So what happened? We'll just start from the beginning. So just prior to the Spanish arrival, there were some major empires kind of around the world, or around in this area of the world. Most of the territory was dominated by little small tribal groups. They might have had some level of civilization, but most of them were living kind of in a tribal lifestyle with not too much going on. The main cultural or big powerful civilizations were the Aztecs, Maya, and Inca. Now the Maya at this time had undergone they'd kind of declined a bit, but they still had a lot of civilization. They just didn't have much of a central leadership anymore. But the Aztecs and the Inca, the Aztecs you see up there in red and the Inca in green, they had lots of civilization, and they also had armies. And so it was quite interesting that the Spanish were able to conquer this all so quickly. So the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire kind of shows what happened in most of the other places. So we'll go over this one in most detail. And you can see Cuba is there on the side. I have a little arrow pointing to it. That had already been colonized when the Spanish started to look into going into the Mexico area. Now, one thing we have to remember is it was colonized, but not by that many people, right? There's still very, very small groups of people coming out, and there weren't giant, cities being built, just little tiny colonial outposts where you could dock your ships. So it wasn't massive, but it was starting to grow. So what happened in 1519, so this is about 10 years after Columbus has died, Hernan Cortez was issued a license to explore and potentially conquer the lands in the Yucatan Peninsula. So licenses at this time were given out by the King and Queen of Spain. And they kind of, what it did was it allowed other people to go and conquer these lands under the Spanish crown. It wouldn't cost the Spanish government any money, but it would become their land. But what the deal was that if you went and did it, you could get a portion of all the loot or whatever gold or resources you found. And a lot of times you also ended up with a prominent position in the newly conquered territory. So Hernan Cortez was issued one to go and explore this and potentially conquer the lands there. And this was done at his own expense. So he actually spent basically all his money to get this license and to equip people to come with, and then he also took on big loans to do it. Now the local governor in Cuba, he wanted the power of conquering the Yucatan for himself, and ordered that Cortez would only explore, because if he actually started conquering, then Cortez would be allowed to, in a sense, have some sort of control over that area. Now Cortez wasn't really playing along. And so this guy tried to have Cortez removed, and he ultimately succeeded to some degree in having him removed. There's he's not in full control here, but he did have a bit of control. And he tried to actually have Cortez arrested, but Cortez managed to slip out of that. And so Cortez sets off without the local Spanish governor's approval. And this is kind of one of those moments where you have the die is cast. So that comes from when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, right? He made a choice. If he didn't cross, then he could have gone back and lived as normal. But once he crossed it with his army, he had basically declared war on and he had to kind of see it through to victory or death. And so Cortez is in a similar situation. He's gone out without really permission. And so now he's basically an outlaw. And so he could be executed upon his return if he hasn't accomplished something great, or, basically earned his worth at this point. So he sets sail with about 630 men as an outlaw. So this isn't a massive troop, right? He's going up against an empire. And you think of these empires had thousands upon thousands upon thousands, probably tens of thousands of people, right? And he sets sail with 630 men, right, to conquer this whole area. So what he does is he first meets some Spaniards who actually were living with the Mayan people. And if we go back here, you can see Mayan right there, where it says Chichen Itza. That little point there was where he first kind of arrived. And he actually found some Spaniards who had been living there because their ship had crashed and they just ended up being stuck there. One man he'd married some of the local people, and he was now renowned to be a great warrior amongst them, and he had earned lots of respect in the community, and he just lived amongst the community. There was also a friar, like a Franciscan, like monk, and he was there too, and he was also kind of involved in the community, but the friar decided to join Cortez and acted as a translator amongst the Mayan people because they both had learned the language. The guy who had some children there decided he was going to stay. So he then continued down, up around the Mayan Peninsula, or the Yucatan Peninsula, and he came into Aztec territory, where he met some of the emperor's representatives. One thing to know is that the viceroy of Cuba, or whoever the governor of Cuba, had sent soldiers to try and capture Cortez, but he beats them at this battle of Cempoala. But that's a minor thing. But anyways, he meets the Aztec kind of representatives, and he talks to them, and they give him a bunch of gifts, and they kind of tried to convince him not to go on anymore. But because they were giving him such nice gifts, he thought there was probably a lot of money there. So he decided to keep going. What happened along the way was an interesting story, right? The Aztecs, they basically ruled by fear and force. What their religion said, you had to constantly sacrifice people to stop the end of the world. And so what they often did was they would attack their neighboring villages, conquer them, and take tributes of sacrifices, right? So there was they would sacrifice a lot of these neighboring people, and the neighboring people didn't really like this. So when the Spanish arrived, a lot of these people were like, oh, wow, maybe these guys will be a bit better than the Aztecs. And so a whole heap of them joined with the Spanish and helped them out a lot. So the Spanish made ally after ally, and even some bigger cities became allies. And actually, one of the cities that I was reading is kind of interesting, that the Aztecs left it unconquered simply so they could constantly attack it every year to steal people. So they were basically, harvesting people from these some of these settlements. So these guys became allies with the Spanish. So while the Spanish were few in number, they ended up having a massive troop of people coming with them that outnumbered the Aztecs eventually, with all these indigenous people. So as the Spanish made their way, they made a lot of friends. They also taught people about God and baptized people, though what they actually understood is obviously a bit shaky, because the translation wasn't always there, and also some of these Spaniards weren't exactly maybe as well read they weren't as competent with the Bible, and they might not have known. They might have taught some heresies. There's just a lot of mix up there, but there were baptizing people. And yeah, they taught people about God, and a lot of the indigenous people did start to leave their old idols. So on the way, they went to a city called Cholula, and this city did actually offer some marginal resistance, and they were planning on killing the Spaniards while they slept. At least that's how the story goes. And so this city was ultimately destroyed. Now, this actually made a lot of the Aztec allies, who were kind of on the side of the Aztecs, kind of a bit worried about what would happen if the Spanish came to their cities. So it lost the Aztecs quite a few allies. So yeah, the story is really complex, and a lot of fighting happens between here and now. The Spanish come into the Aztec capital, which is Tenochtitlan, and then they leave, and then they go in again, and then they get pushed out, and then it's a whole bunch of things. Eventually, they come and they conquer the city. And today, this city is where Mexico City is. So you see, or you can see on this map, right? They're basically in the same spot there. So this becomes the capital of what's today Mexico. And yeah, so this is a very well built up place, and it was actually quite defensible because it was sort of like a Venice almost, right? It was in the middle of a lake, and you had to use bridges to get there. So yeah, it's an interesting story. So they did eventually conquer this, and then so that was kind of that. Now on the other side with the Incan Empire, which we saw over here, the green, the Incan Empire was a similar story basically. One guy comes over there and he discovers this empire. What happened when he arrived is actually the indigenous people there got smallpox, and the Incan emperor dies, and this sets off a civil war between his two sons, who's the next king. And Pizarro returns. He goes back to Spain, comes back with a license to conquer the Incans, and is helped by the numerous tribes that were oppressed by the Incans. So it's very similar, right, to the last time where the same thing happens, right? The Incans were oppressing people, and the people who they were oppressing joined with the Spanish to attack them. So yeah, it ends up with them being defeated. Finally, the rest of the area, right? There was Mayan resistance after, so the Mayans who initially weren't as well, or weren't as sophisticated. Well, they were sophisticated, but they weren't as centralized. They weren't conquered first by the Spanish, but the Aztecs were. Afterwards, the Mayans started to get kind of picked off one by one, with the last Mayan town falling in 1697, right? This is almost 200 years later. So it was just a slow kind of creep as the Spanish conquered more and more land. And yeah, that basically happened everywhere, right? The Spanish just kind of kept going and conquering slowly. This picture up here in the black and white one is quite interesting because it also shows something. What happened even up until the last village was often the Spanish were fighting with other indigenous people, right? The other indigenous people would help them conquer. So it wasn't like the Spanish were conquering everything. They were actually getting a lot of help from other indigenous people. But yeah, if you go to Central America today, there's still Mayan people today, and they're even some of the languages still exist. So that's kind of interesting, and yeah, so these whole civilizations were there. There was interesting things and thinking, but it was all conquered. And ultimately you end up with the Spanish having this massive chunk of land where they found tons of gold, and they brought a lot of gold back to Europe, to the point where actually gold started to be not worth that much because they kept finding brought so much back that it caused massive inflation. But yeah, so that's the big thing. And actually, a lot of people ended up just looking, right, for gold. There were all these rumors of the city of super wealth, and they all would look around. Now there was tons of cities with lots of gold, so they did find them. But in the Fountain of Youth, there was people looking. So there's all these cool adventures that you might want to look up at some point. People adventuring through, and it's really an interesting time in history where people, just went off and cut their way through the forests ended up finding cities, and it's quite an adventurous time. Now, of course, there was lots of things that probably happened that were, fights and things that weren't as nice. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting time to learn about. And yeah, eventually, all this becomes part of the Spanish Empire, and yeah, eventually it also rebels and becomes a bunch of countries that are there today. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this little lesson on the Spanish, the beginning of the Spanish Empire, especially in North America. Okay, adios.